My name is Chelsea Meggitt, and I'm here to talk to you today about standards for subsea seabed warfare systems. Now, I thought long and hard about how I could make a talk about standards interesting, and I'm hoping that adding subsea seabed warfare to the mix will help. But ultimately, I realized that while standards might not be the most interesting topic to talk about, that doesn't make it any less important. So let's dive in. Subsea seabed warfare, which I will refer to as SSW for the rest of my talk, differs from undersea warfare in that undersea warfare has typically been limited to a certain depth. With this new emphasis on the seabed, the need for standards has become apparent. Today, I'm going to define what we mean by SSW, explain why SSW needs standards, and give a current state, and examine where the gaps exist. I'll also provide some examples of where standards are both appropriate and necessary. Then I'll give you a sense as to our suggestions for a path forward for the development of these standards. IEEE, an industry leader in standards development, explains that standards serve as the fundamental building blocks for system development and establish consistent protocols that can be universally understood and adopted. Standards allow us to speak the same language. They allow each individual system element to interoperate and form a fully functional system that is more than the sum of its parts. As they pertain to government systems, standards lower the total cost of ownership, allow systems to produce more predictable outputs, and ensure various components are compatible with one another. They also provide users with an assurance that products and services from various sources meet a recognized level of quality. You may have heard that the future of naval warfare is undersea. The objective of SSW is to ensure that the U.S. maintains dominance in the constantly evolving undersea warfare landscape. Organized under OPNAV 97, SSW combines and integrates programs and projects from several different Navy PMOs. It brings together several formally separate warfare areas, including offensive and defensive mine warfare, undersea surveillance, and communications. SSW aims to define the future role of undersea forces in operations and warfighting, determining requirements for platforms, systems, payloads, people, and posture, and translating requirements into decisions, policies, and funding. Essentially, SSW incorporates subsea sensor systems, communications, power systems and subsystems, autonomous and unmanned vehicles, and undersea distributed systems into a common operating picture. These systems can be cabled, networked, or standalone, and can be long-term fixed, expeditionary, or fully mobile relocatable. This graphic, supplied by GD Mission Systems, gives you a sense as to the type of systems involved in subsea warfare, and highlights that they must all be able to interact with the others in order to function as a cohesive system. If even one of these system elements fails to interoperate with the others, the results could not only be disastrous, but deadly. This graphic, provided by Bard College, depicts just a few types of unmanned and autonomous undersea systems involved in the SSW mission. For the purposes of this discussion, I am going to use the term UUVs to describe autonomous and unmanned vehicles of different types. As you can see, these UUVs come in vastly different shapes and sizes and have differing functions depending on the need. While having a fleet of various vehicles with differing functions increases mission effectiveness, it also poses challenges to the infrastructure involved with them. While many of these vehicles might go to the seafloor as part of their missions, it is probably inconceivable and at least impractical to consider installing specialized infrastructure for each different size, shape, and class of UUV onto the seafloor. Cost and complexity alone involved with developing infrastructure for each individual class of vehicles blows that approach right out of the water, so to speak. Ultimately, the goal of a system is to accomplish a mission. And one of the goals of standards is to bring disparate systems together to provide a complete operating picture for the warfighter. Standards enable system developers to develop systems that enhance overall mission effectiveness rather than the effectiveness of individual elements. Without some level of standardization, there is limited or no interoperability between systems. Essentially, standards provide the framework for industry to demonstrate that they can play well with others. Let me give you an example of when standards went well. I'm sure you all have heard of intermodal shipping containers or ISO containers. They now come in standard sizes that can be carried by trucks, trains, and ships worldwide, thanks to prolonged negotiations in the 1960s and 1970s. These containers greatly reduce shipping costs and help expand the global economy. Now, it should be somewhat obvious why the world needs standards, but it might not be so apparent why SSW needs standards. Well, for one, to have a cohesive force, we have to have a cohesive vision for achieving that force's objectives. Without standards, systems can fail to interoperate and fail to accommodate components from a diverse supplier base. However, the appropriate implementation of standards can lower the total cost of system ownership for the customer and the overall cost of development. Standards enable the interchangeability and modularity of system and subsystem components. As a specific example, appropriate implementation of standards could result in consistent UUV intervention operations through standardized interfaces between vehicles and SSW systems and components. That's not to say standard implementation is an easy or popular task. The development of standards for SSW is not without its challenges. For example, the sheer variety of sizes and configurations of vehicle types presents challenges. We can take an example from automobiles on land, which universally have 12-volt electrical power systems. However, no such standard appears to exist for UUVs. Another challenge faced by proponents of standards is getting industry consensus. Unfortunately, companies are often unaware of the strategic significance of standardization. It might appear that the cost and time involved with the development of standards outweighs the benefits. But by participating in the development of relevant industry standards, companies can actually gain both strategic and tactical advantages. In fact, standards can encourage competition in the marketplace and can be used by businesses to exert market pressure on companies further down the value chain. Also, businesses are able to use standards to broaden their potential markets. It's said that you can be a part of the solution or you can live with the solution developed by others. Another perceived challenge with standardization is the sheer pace of technological development. However, this just acts as motivation for standards-making bodies to adapt. You may have heard the term Ocean of Things, which is a play on the term Internet of Things, with the objective of seeding the seas with thousands of floating sensors that monitor everything that passes, from aircraft to submarines. The aim of this DARPA project is to achieve persistent maritime situational awareness across large ocean areas. According to the DARPA program manager, John Watterson, while satellites can provide some information, there are gaps in their coverage. Optical satellites can't see through clouds, radar satellites only have limited coverage, and none of them can say much about what's going on underwater. The Internet of Things would not exist without standards. Likewise, this new concept of the Ocean of Things will require development and implementation of numerous standards to facilitate technology development. These standards will need to include data acquisition, data processing, data transmission, and communications, including encryption. While standards are undeniably important, for the most part, adherence to current standards is voluntary. There does come a point, though, as systems become more complex and interdependent, where the benefits of adoption outweigh the consequences of not. Now, you might be wondering why on earth I'm suggesting SSW needs standards, and there's several reasons. First off, total system integration depends on standardization. In other words, for various elements to interact with each other, there needs to be trust. Standards establish trust between each element of a system. Let me give you a somewhat personable example. If we are all in a conference room at NDIA together this year, we would all be elements of a social system. If I wanted to connect with you, I'd start by establishing some level of trust and communicating in a language that you all could understand. Perhaps I'd provide a business card or a capability sheet. Maybe I'd even give a presentation. And I'd introduce myself so that you know who I am. From a social standpoint, each of these interactions is a standard means of establishing trust. Standards give systems a common language in the form of a technical specification and ensure that all of the moving pieces in a system can work together. But without that very basic level of trust, we couldn't work as a mutually beneficial system. Ultimately, you don't want your UUV to go down to a system underwater and not have the right tool. Current standards for undersea systems have evolved somewhat sporadically, with some different developers using different standards even throughout their own product lines. If we expect SSW systems to function, we have to have some consistency. Now let's step back and analyze a few types of standards. Proprietary standards evolve from a product line or specific vendor. An example of proprietary standards is Apple's Lightning connectors. Apple would say the Lightning connector is a standard across all Apple products. Proprietary standards are based on dominant technology produced by a single company, and it doesn't translate to the UUV market, where one manufacturer's standards don't necessarily apply across their whole UUV product offering, let alone the UUV industry as a whole. The issues with proprietary standards should be pretty apparent, in that the result is a single supplier with total control over a product's functionality and usefulness. Proprietary standards typically increase the cost of ownership by imposing royalties and license fees as well. On the other hand, we have open standards, which are developed and adopted by some authorized standardization body. An example of an open technology standard would be USB connectors, which are used across devices and manufacturers. Often, they don't require licensing fees or royalties and ultimately result in lower cost of ownership. To the consumer, USB is just as reliable and lower cost than the alternative. Open standards give users substantial flexibility and agility as they develop their solutions. Open standards act as living guidelines to help developers integrate best practices into technology-enabled systems. Solutions can accommodate different standards. For example, our cell phone chargers have the ability to accommodate different power voltages. Another distinction between standard types considers the differences between performance and design standards. Performance standards establish a goal that regulated parties must achieve, typically characterized by a threshold above or below which the regulated party must remain. For example, if all cars produced after a given year needed to meet certain emission levels. This doesn't dictate how the car manufacturers meet the standard emission levels, just states that they must do it somehow. This provides substantially more flexibility in product development, as it doesn't limit developers to a specific means of accomplishing a goal, it just states the goal. Conversely, design standards mandate that regulated entities employ a specific means of compliance. For example, if all cars produced after a certain year were required to be equipped with a specific type of catalytic converter, which is a device that reduces the toxicity of emissions. This type of standard is prescriptive and restricts users of that standard pretty significantly by mandating a certain component be used to accomplish a stated goal. Another analogy would be the difference between a statement of work, which tends to be a design standard, and a performance work statement, which typically is a performance standard. A main point I'd like to call out here is that I'm not advocating solely for the use of either design or performance standards. As I mentioned, design standards can be fairly constrictive and end up limiting creativity and innovation. They can level the playing field, so to speak, but they can also result in product commoditization. Design standards might be more applicable for things like connectors, which we would probably expect to have some sort of volume associated with them. Performance-based standards allow for more developer flexibility and creativity when creating SSW solutions for the government, and they permit regulated entities to choose the approach that suits them best in their situation. But if implemented incorrectly or unclear, performance standards can also result in systems that lack interoperability. Ultimately, a blend of performance and design standards will likely address the challenges posed with SSW systems. Now, there's countless standards in today's regulatory environment. They're used by every industry imaginable and cover countless topics. SSW, however, is surprisingly void of applicable standards. Today's standards differ between industries such as healthcare, engineering, manufacturing, public health and safety, and others. These standards are developed by thousands of standards organizations throughout the world and can pretty much standardize anything to make life easier, safer, or more productive. In fact, just the definition of what a standard is varies between some of these organizations. Some examples of varying standards include standards for electrical products, communication systems, quality, material science, engineering, information technology, environmental impact. I mean, the list really goes on and on. In addition to industry adopted standards, the military has its own set of adopted standards and specifications in the forms of military standards, mil standards, and mil specs. Ultimately, out of these thousands of widely used standards, none really appear to provide a framework for SSW system development. In fact, there are several gaps that can be identified when it comes to applicable standards for SSW systems. For instance, there appears to be no standard mechanical interfaces between various elements of SSW systems, which means there is no guarantee when your UUV goes down to plug something in that it will be compatible with the rest of the system, or that a component manufacturer working specifically on components for UUVs would be able to use the same component on more than one type of UUV. Have you ever gone to do a job and just realized you didn't have the right tools to complete it? Another example of gaps that we're going to see in SSW standards include launch and recovery systems. Let me quickly take you back to an earlier slide. Here you'll get just a taste of how many different sizes, shapes, and configurations that UUVs might come in. It's clear from this image that a one-size-fits-all launch and recovery system just isn't going to work. I mean, not all UUVs will fit in torpedo tubes. Even with different vehicle systems from a single source, they can have dramatically different interface requirements. Also, there's really no way to ensure that your UUV is as safe and secure when it returns from a mission as it was when it was sent out. How do you know if your UUV has been tampered with? What if it's carrying malicious code? If your UUV has no means of demonstrating that it has had a safe and secure mission, the risk is potentially enormous. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you some examples of where I think standards are really needed. I already mentioned docking stations and how a one-size-fits-all approach is probably impractical, but this is not the only area that could really use some standards. Let me give you a little bit of a personal example. When I was younger, I went to London to visit with some family, and the first day that I got there, I went to plug in my hairdryer. I found out pretty quick it didn't work. Frankly, I was shocked and totally unaware that there was a standard for that electrical interface. Unlike this electrical interface on land, there are very few interface standards applicable to SSW. What you see here is an example of a standardized docking station developed by a company called Blue Logic. When I say standard, it means there is a standard mechanical interface, a standard electrical interface, and standard data transfer interface, all of which can accommodate a broad range of vehicles. The example here by Blue Logic hosts 3 different power levels. It removes the need for various connectors. It has a universal interface, which, as you can see, accommodates multiple types, classes, sizes, shapes, and weights of vehicles. And this platform permits vehicles to download mission data and upload new missions, and can accommodate a variety of power sources. What you'll see here is a diagram highlighting the potential interfaces required for a UUV payload. All of the arrows in this image require standards to enable reconfigurability and support of multiple missions. Standard interfaces to facilitate interconnections with various vehicles, sensors, and payload modules. Modular structure to minimize test and retest as functions are added, expanded, or modified. I mean, these various types of standards play a role in how the payload interacts with the UUV. For example, when the payload is connected to the payload bay, it's going to talk to the vehicle, and the vehicle is going to talk to it. This means there has to be a two-way data protocol. Similarly, the vehicle power interface required standards to enable the payload system. Payload interface standards enable flexible and interchangeable UUV work and mission payloads. The Global Positioning System, GPS, is the predominant means of obtaining positioning, navigation, and timing information for both military and civilian systems and applications. However, the radio frequency basis for GPS also means that its signals cannot penetrate seawater. Thus, undersea GPS is effectively denied. This graphic, provided by BAE Systems, depicts the Positioning System for Deep Ocean Navigation, or Poseidon program, which aims to develop an undersea system that provides an omnipresent, robust positioning across ocean basins. By ranging to a small number of long-range acoustic sources, an undersea platform would be able to obtain continuous, accurate positioning without surfacing for a GPS fix. The DARPA Poseidon program may be the beginning of an underwater navigation standard. Open standard system architecture is an architecture development approach that utilizes open standards to reduce the risk and cost of ownership and development of systems. Risk mitigation and cost reduction are significant pressures and motivations to utilize open standard architecture to develop and apply SSW standards. Industry implementation of standards is sometimes controversial, and that's for a variety of reasons. The not invented here issue tends to arise as industry tends to think their inventions are the best and others must not be up to snuff. There's also a certain amount of fear of missing out when standards are applied. There could be a fear of market share loss or loss of leverage over a particular market segment. But all of these fears are essentially overcome by the benefits of standardization. Open standards allow for enhanced obsolescence management. They lower the costs and risks to both the customers and the developers, and they fuel industry collaboration and innovation, and ultimately result in systems that are fielded faster. Given the current emphasis on speed to market within the DoD environment, implementation of open standards can spell success. Now, it may be presumptuous for me to make suggestions about how the SSW industry goes about developing and implementing standards, but that hasn't stopped me before. As I mentioned earlier, open standards should act as living guidelines, the framework on which standardization is built into the industry, but not be so stringent so as to limit innovation. Our suggestions would be to involve industry, academia, and government in the development of working groups and consortia to develop standards specific to SSW. These standards might be a combination of performance and design standards, but they would be agreed upon by key stakeholders. By encouraging industry collaboration on standards, innovation becomes more widespread. Businesses not only reduce the economic risk of their R&D activities by participating in standardization, but can also lower their own R&D costs and therefore the cost to the customer. I do hope that I haven't put you all asleep during this conversation, and I very much appreciate you all taking the time to listen to my presentation today. If you have any questions, my contact information will be on the next slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and hopefully we can connect.